Welcome. This is just a short note to inform you that due to the Zoom setting, the screen is partially covered by some videos of the people attending the meeting. Due to privacy, I have covered these with a black box. However, there will be times in the presentation where a few words will be covered by this. We will re-record this presentation in due time, but we have uploaded now so you're able to watch it. Thank you.
Okay, right, the magician's tricks. So the origin of the word magic is pertaining to magic, working or produced by enchantment, having supernatural qualities or powers. It's really any technology that's not understood, often resembles magic. So a good part of what we've been doing with the behavior insights and all the psychology is once we show people what it is, it's no longer magic, they can see it everywhere. And they can also, protect themselves much more from the influence. So the magician will use misdirection to fall. Magician will influence decisions via forcing. Now this is where people will have their decision influenced, but they won't be aware of it. The magician will make one thing appear as another. And I think we're all aware that this is something that we've seen throughout the last couple of years. So first of all, acknowledge ourselves to still function in this craziness. And I think really all the people that are challenging the narrative, there's one common thing, which is really they're more concerned with truth than the ego. So they've been able to put the truth as being more important than being right. So there's limited resources. So really we're looking for substance over style. So there won't be too many bells and whistles. And as we mentioned, learning is a bit like buying some apple juice from the store, where you have all those bits in it. It's going to be shaken up. But once we learn, it relaxes and then we absorb. I find it often takes me 3 or 4 times of watching something before it really goes in there. So just relax, take in as much as you can, and obviously you can re-watch. It's being recorded. I think today is going to be very interesting. It's really kind of cool when you start to see through the tricks. And then you start to spot them everywhere. And, I often will tweet a lot that when there's an article that comes out, I'm able to point out why they've used certain wording or why they've, used a certain story. And of course, then the story loses its power. So today's agenda, we're just going to review a couple of concepts that was going to allow us to see the tricks that are being used on us, the tricks of the mind as they were. And then we're going to review some of the magician's tricks. And we've used the word magic because it's quite entertaining. It's very apt for what's going on. But I think the more and more we look at the biases, the more and more we look at the psychology, then we notice some common patterns about what's going on. So there's pretty much too much education and not enough learning in general. And I think the reasons for this is really for us to be conditioned to not to question authority. It makes life much easier for those in authority. And of course, Einstein said that unthinking, respectful authority is the greatest enemy of truth. We tend to hate making mistakes. This is very problematic, and it, especially when you have doctors and academics, being scared of making mistakes or not having conditions where they're allowed to make mistakes. So then you start getting cover-ups. And of course, as Dyson said, success teaches you nothing. Failures teach you everything. So making mistakes is the most important thing you can do. So really, if we really want to get good at reaching people, we really need to have a position where there really isn't mistakes. If you're trying one door, if that doesn't work, you try another door. Because, I think it's fair to say I've probably made more mistakes than anyone. And of course, that's been a good thing because then I can show people a lot of the mistakes, just don't copy. And the third thing is that a lot of people feel that they cannot make a difference. And of course, one person can make a difference and everyone should try. So invariably, it's actually the few people that do make a difference, that they make huge differences. So we're just going to quickly look through a slide or two to review what drives behavior, because once you understand this, then the tricks start to make sense. So effectively, this picture is representing that the rider, and it's a really very powerful metaphor, that the rider is representing our conscious mind and the horse is representing our unconscious mind. And of course, the question is, who decides where you go? Is it the rider or is it the horse? Now, those of us that have ever been horse riding will know that it's the horse that has the last say. But a lot of us are under the illusion that our conscious mind decides. And it's quite easy to use an analogy of the phobia. If you're scared of spiders in the UK, you will most certainly consciously know there's nothing to be scared of, but that doesn't stop you being scared of them. The unconscious mind has the fear. So effectively, we're always moving away from pain and towards pleasure. So that's the natural progression that we do. However, in life, a lot of the time, there's obstacles and resistance. And what happens is that when the obstacles are too big, what a lot of people will do is they will watch TV, junk food, drugs, alcohol, anything really to remove the sort of discomfort that they feel. And really the movement is really emotions that drive us from one place to the other. So if we look at this, in this way, we can say emotions are the driving force. We will choose the path that feels good emotionally, which is why, in school, if we were conditioned to feel good every time we got a question right and to absolutely hate every time we got one wrong, then we're going to really be in that sort of habitual way. And our brains love cognitive ease. So we really want to take the path of least resistance. And that's really going to be a key part when you look at what's going on in the tricks that we're going to take a look at. So we move away from pain and we move towards pleasure. So how is this used against us in a general sense? And it's really problem, reaction, solution. So in fact, any marketer will create a problem or a perceived problem. Your reaction will be to move away from the problem and towards the solution. And obviously we can see how that's working, that if the problem was, say, a virus, and then fear was moving them away from the virus, and then someone proposed a solution, that is what you would see most people move. So there's a desire or fear of moving away from something, and then there's this expected conditioned reaction, which they normally know how we will react, and there's a movement towards this solution. And a lot of the time, the solution is products, services, compulsory purchases, and subscription models. And I think you'll see that happening a lot in today's world. So I think it's really important that we understand a couple of things about our brain before we go on to looking at the tricks that are played on us. And that really is that we're more than our brain. So this picture on the left really represents our consciousness. For those spiritually minded, it's whatever you want it to be, really. It's just that we're much more than our brain and our body. So really, whatever we are, we're inhabiting a brain and we're inhabiting a body. Now, both of them are not perfect, and the brain particularly has to take a lot of shortcuts. And in this is what we find is where we're vulnerable to influence. So in fact, we are very fallible. We're very vulnerable to influence, and we make mistakes. The brain is an incredible organism. It really is an incredible organ, but it does make mistakes. It does have vulnerabilities. And of course, what's happened now with the technology is that anyone that understands those vulnerabilities can actually exploit them. And I think that's what we're seeing. So one way I like to sort of explain the situation we're in is that our brain is almost like a laptop. And of course, what we really want is virus software. But without that, then all sorts of ideas can make it into our mind. And if you look at the general public, all sorts of ideas are making it into their mind. There's a lot of people that are actually scared of their own shadow right now. And it's not an equal proportionate response to the danger or the risk. So this suggests that things are appearing completely different to how a balanced way in which they should appear. So let me show you a short little video that really just shows in our perception, like our visual perception, how it's really easy to not see things how they are. So a question that I have, so if you think about the answer, is the A square much darker than B? Is A actually the same color, or is A just a little darker than B? Okay, and let's have a look. So video will take a few seconds. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag both the squares off to the left and see when we put them next to each other, how different they actually are. And as you'll see, they are actually the same color. Now,
this is really hard for us to try and comprehend. So we go into design mode and we're going to drag the A over to the A and then drag it over to the B. And you'll see nothing's happening. It's just being dragged from one to the other. So in fact, A and B are the same color. And then of course, what's actually happening in our visual field is that because of these shadows, we are assuming that this is actually a lot lighter. So our brain makes adjustments, and it's these adjustments that it makes a lot of the time that leave us open, you know, a lot of the shortcuts leave us open to influence. So then what we need to address now is what's known as these cognitive biases, because a lot of the tricks that are played on us are actually because our brain does have these biases built into it. So a bias really is that the brain's making a technical error, and a lot of the time it's okay because it's doing it on purpose, but there's sometimes where it will actually lead us into some hot water, or in fact, in this example, some cold water. So they ran this study where they had the students or the subjects put their hand in freezing water for 60 seconds. That was the first test. So then they put their hands in freezing water for 60 seconds, and then they had to do an additional 30 seconds. But the additional 30 seconds, they were allowed to put a little bit hot in there, so it was a little bit less cold. And then they were given the option to either repeat A or B. Now, which one would you repeat? Okay. Now, it's quite obvious that A is 60 seconds of discomfort, but B is the same 60 seconds of discomfort, but an additional 30 seconds of a little bit less discomfort. So obviously A is the thing that we should choose. 80% of people chose B. Now that doesn't make any logical sense, but the brain wasn't working logically. When the brain remembered these two instances, it remembered B less harsh because the ending of it was less harsh. So it's not recording exactly what happened, it's recording what we felt about what happened. So A was just horrible all the way through, but because B had a little bit of relief near the end, people were then moving towards B, which makes no logical sense whatsoever. Now, one of the other things that our brain does is it takes lots of shortcuts, and that has to because there's too much information to deal with. But if people understand these shortcuts, then we can also be influenced. And of course, lots of the time, we just do these rules of thumb to make life easier. So a bias is just not seeing things actually as they are. It's seeing them slanted one way or the other. And we're going to look at one of the biases now in a short video that's really interesting, and it's called attention bias. And they also call it change blindness. So it's the inability to see when things are changing because we've got our attention focused on one thing. So I'm going to play a short video.
So we feel like we're aware of everything, that we're taking in all of the details, and that if something unimportant happens, we'll automatically notice it. It'll capture our attention. The reality is that we often don't notice unexpected things because we're aware of far less of our world than we think we are.
So how much or how little are we actually aware of? We decided to recreate one of Simon's most famous experiments to see for ourselves. Here's the setup. Our senior series producer, Vin, poses as a lost pedestrian and asks a passerby for directions.
Excuse me, I'm looking for the skyline.
Then we break the two up, walking through them holding a large sheet of wood. Now watch as I replace Vin. You might think people would notice the switch, but almost half the time they didn't. Of course, that means more than half the time they did. We only tried the experiment 9 times, and by no means was it good science. But we were surprised 4 people didn't notice the switch. In Simon's original experiment, 7 out of 15 people didn't either. So what determines whether or not you can figure out the switch?
When you look at another person, you encode what's relevant for what you're doing right then, in that case, giving directions, and you don't pay attention to the details that are irrelevant, say what color their shirt is or exactly how tall they are. As long as you are able to make sense of the meaning of the scene and roughly the main categories of that person, say their height, their age, what race they are, what sex they are, as long as those important things don't change, the meaning of the scene really hasn't changed, and you're not going to notice that anything's different. So we feel.
So with the attention bias, what you'll see a lot of the time, and the very famous one of that is the gorilla in the selective attention test. So if someone's got their attention on something very focused, they're going to miss a lot of other things. So how many people have had their attention over the last 18 months on certain subjects, and they're going to miss everything else. So the famous one of that was the gorilla, where they asked you to count, and I think we've all seen that, where they asked you to count how many times their team are bouncing the ball. And then a gorilla walks across the screen, and pretty much 50% of people do not see the gorilla. So this in the magician's toolbox really is misdirection. Yeah, to taking your attention on the one thing, and then you'll miss other things. Now, the next one is actually really interesting, and I put it in there because it's kind of a, a gentle one, but it's one that we would all experience. And if we don't know about it, I'm sure that we've all fallen for it. So we'll give an example that we have a simple decision to make. So we've gone to the cinema and we fancy some popcorn, okay? We go to the desk and they've got two options. There's a regular for £3 and a large for £6. And then we will generally, when given two options, we'll decide which one we really want, and then we will purchase it. However, once they understood how we made decisions, then they was able to manipulate our decisions. So effectively what happens is now, if you go for popcorn, there'll be a regular for £3, there'll be the large for £6, but now they bring in a medium, which is the decoy, and the medium is £5.50. Now, in all the studies I've watched in this, empirical studies, they filmed them so many times, people now focus on this gap. Oh, it's only 50 pence to go from a medium to a large. And what you see is that most people will now choose the large. So they've been able to influence the purchasing from the regular to the large, which is no, small mean feat. And they bought in the medium. They don't sell, they hardly ever sell any medium. That is there as just a decoy. So by manipulating our environment, the magicians are able to actually change someone's decision, which is pretty incredible. And then we get on to one that's really key, which is the conformity bias. Now, this is another short video I'm going to play. It's another famous experiment, which is really profoundly happening in our society right now.
Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we still go along. 1.
Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
1.
The Ash experiment.
So what's really kind of amazing about that experiment is that a lot of the time you'll see a difference between what people think would happen and what they actually would do. So there's lots of recent experiments where they have people sitting in a waiting room. One person will stand up when a bell goes, and then what happens is people start copying them. because we're often copying those around us, and a lot of the time unconsciously. And there's one very famous study around the authority principle, which really shows how what people think they would do and what they actually would do are often different. So they asked a group of nurses if they would prescribe a cocktail of drugs to a patient, and nearly all of them said no, because it's potentially dangerous. However, when they did a separate study and they had an act to phone up nurses pretending to be a doctor, instructing them to prescribe those drugs, most of them went to do so. So in fact, in a lot of the public, a lot of the population, you'll see this real disconnect between what they think they would do and what they actually would do. So hopefully that gives you some of the ways that we're actually, our environment or our perception is manipulated to actually change our decisions, particularly on that last one, because what you'll notice is a really constant theme. Whenever they're talking about something they want compliance on, they will very rarely quote when there's low compliance. Okay, they won't tell you any numbers. What they're always doing is trying to feed you the most convincing numbers that everyone's doing it. Yeah, so it's always trying to get the stats to look like it's just the done thing. So then we come on to another important thing, which actually is cognitive dissonance, because this is also being used at great lengths to actually adjust our behavior. So really, cognitive dissonance is really quite a simple subject, which is you have an idea and a belief in an image that clashes with another idea, a belief, an image that you have. So for instance, classic example is, having a donut whilst on the diet, then you might just rationalize, oh, it's okay, I don't want to be too strict. So because dissonance, when what we do differs from what we believe, it doesn't feel comfortable. We really have to resolve that. So then a really good way to explain a lot of the cognitive dissonances that we're seeing and how it's adjusting people's behavior is to use this metaphor that we introduced last week, which I'll go through briefly now, which is the office of behavior. Now, what we have is that the person on the left would represent us, and the person on the right is someone that we wish to have a conversation with. So effectively, this rope is representing what could be termed a tug of war. So the reason we put this here is that if we present a fact to this person that's different from the fact or the idea that they already believe, what will happen is that will create cognitive dissonance. And in fact, this is one of the most important elements or facts around the whole narrative that I think we need to understand. And this, I think, is probably the single biggest reason, excuse me, why facts and logic are not working with people, because what they've shown time and time again through studies is there's a thing called belief polarity, which is you present a fact that is far different from the one the person currently believes, create dissonance. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, people want cognitive ease. So they have a choice. Either they reject the external fact or they change their beliefs. People don't like changing their beliefs, so they're going to just reject the fact. So this puts us into a bit of a quandary. Now, if we think why this gentleman is rejecting the fact, because what he's doing is that this office block is representing his unconscious mind, all the things that he knows to be true that he's not currently thinking of. So when this is presented, he will go to his mind to check what's in there. Now, this also shows us what governs our behavior. So our behavior is really the only thing that you would see, but the behavior, what is that driven by? Well, it's driven by our knowledge, our skills, and our habits. We don't just randomly behave. We have lots of habits that, we just behave that way, and, and knowing how to behave in a certain situation. This level is actually driven by our beliefs and our values. Like, we're not really going to act or build habits that go against what we believe. So if we believe, inherently we're a good person, then we're not going to go around doing crazy things. So the beliefs are really important, but then again, what drives the beliefs and the values? So it's our personal identity and how we see ourselves. And this is really key, because how people have seen themselves through the pandemic, and of course, we're always going through a process of trying to see ourselves in the best light, really drives what we believe. And of course, this is what the people pushing the agenda have actually manipulated probably the most. And then we've got our group identity. Now, the group identity is really the groups we're a part of.
Now, for a lot of people, they start and assume the behaviors of the group. Because, I mean, if you talk, for instance, somebody adopted a new religion, what they would usually do is they would adopt the beliefs and values of the religion. So the group identity would supersede them. And this is really one of the most important things, because the pressure on the group puts a lot of pressure on the people to change and act in the same way as the group. And that's what you saw in the conformity bias, is that what a lot of the time, whatever the group does, people will just do the same. And that's why it's one of the most, you know, persuasive elements. Now, if we think about in society in general, we can see that this isn't just a model that conducts our own behavior, it conducts a lot of groups. So if you went into a shop and you saw the staff would have followed certain training programs, and they would act or do, you know, work accordingly to certain policies. So that's been provided by the, you know, human resources and the training. But that would have in turn been provided by the management, which in turn would have been conducted by the CEO. So if the CEO makes a single decision, everything underneath it comes into alignment. Okay, and of course the CEO in the current world climate, most of them are listening to the governing bodies, and they don't tend to go against the governing bodies. So if you want to exert a lot of influence on a system, then all you need to do really in a business is introduce a new governing body, which is why you'll see that these are heavily influenced by special interests, but also with groups. So if you want to, you know, influence a lot of people, then you influence the groups that those people are members of. And there's so many classic examples during this, and the one in the religion where, you know, Biden came out and said that Jesus would have taken the vaccine. So, which is quite ironic, because Jesus, you know, who could heal people, you know, lepers and whatever, would then suddenly take a vaccine. And it's the same for all the religions, that they would have influenced them this way. So, and of course, what the other thing is that they've paid all the influencers in groups a lot of money to actually, you know, enforce and reinforce to follow the policies. So what you'll see is that if we make any changes at these high levels, what you'll see a lot of the time is all these levels will automatically change. And then we can start looking at a lot of examples. So the classic is when someone says you're selfish if you don't do behavior X, Y, and Z, is really creating cognitive dissonance. So, you know, people don't want to feel selfish. So the behavior and the, you know, the self-image of selfishness don't match. So of course, what people will usually do is change their behavior and do whatever people define not to be selfish. So what you'll find is that this tug of war that's been created between levels in this metaphor has been done on purpose to create cognitive dissonance, knowing full well that people will look for the easiest route out. And a lot of the time, the easiest route out is actually to change what they believe or how they see themselves, you know, or if it's mandated, but if it's not, what you'll usually see is the behavior change. And of course, the classic example of when behavior is mandated would be, say, a face covering. So if you mandate it and the person doesn't feel, they don't have an image where they can go against authority, what you're going to see is they will change their beliefs around, you know, the face coverings being, you know, working. But the craziest thing about this, they won't do it consciously. It actually happens unconsciously. And Festermer proved this through various studies, that people will suddenly start to change their views around how they behave, because we can't really exist in dissonance for long. We have to change one thing. So then we've got a classic one here, which is one that I started to create on purpose when talking to people. And I would say, if it turned out the policies, i.e. coming from the group, cause more harm than good, would you still follow them? So now they've got a clash between their value and the group. And obviously, if the group is doing something unhealthy, then the person really needs to either extract themselves from the group or point it out to the group. And then, of course, we've got this where people are identifying with a group identity, whether they're pro this or anti that. And they've got to really have a healthy relationship with their group. So each of these relationships are very key, because this is internal, and this is where you'll see people change. So there's been multiple instances of where
data and information has been presented to get people to change their behavior or their viewpoints. And obviously, if you're getting them to change their how they see themselves, you're effectively changing someone's identity, which is not something that anyone should influence another to do, particularly not in a negative way, but you can do it, you know, by saying to someone how well they've done. That's an ethical use. But you see, in the Mindspace document, which is the document that the government's using to get people to follow public policy, they actually admit in there that if people realize that they're having their identity shifted without their knowledge, they will not be happy. It's covert and it's misleading. Now, this circle represents probably the best way to influence someone's unconscious mind. If you remember back to the horse, if you don't influence the unconscious mind, you're pretty much going to get it rejected if it differs from what they currently think. But if you tell them stories and metaphor, that will always penetrate to some degree. And every person I've spoke to that's changed their view on the narrative will tell me a story. And that story will usually be something that's very relevant and salient to them, and something that's something that's happened in their social circle. So if we now look at this is the Mindspace document. If we look at this side by side against this, we can actually start to see how they're influencing this. So the Mindspace document, its subtext is like its strapline is actually saying influencing behavior through public policy. So by bringing in certain policies, you're going to see everything underneath change. So that's where, you know, you bring in laws, you force change. But a lot of these are actually quite covert. So they know that we're heavily influenced by who communicates information. So every time that someone comes on to the BBC, it will be expert XYZ says you need to do this. So they know that we're very much influenced by authority. And you really could go through this and list any, you know, dozens per one of how information has been presented to us. I mean, one of the defaults, we tend to go with the flow of preset options. So what the government did a few years ago is they changed the organ donor from opt-in to opt-out. And then, of course, it went from 30% to 90% compliance. And of course, one of the ones I've mentioned a few times, which is really very valuable in terms of getting compliance, and that's this commitment. So if somebody can agree to a small act, what will happen is they will change their self-image about how they view that subject. So by getting someone to clap to the sky on a Thursday night, you're going to get that person to change their identity self-image to be very much behind the NHS, which is why you've seen this almost incredible shift in people's view towards the NHS, where a lot of people were, you know, concerned about its funding, etc. Now it got to a point you couldn't mention anything in a negative light. So this actually really allows us to see a lot of the biases that are going on and a lot of the magic that's actually played on our minds. So in summary, we can be easily misled by having either the environment distorted or our perception altered. There really is no way around this. It's just the way the brain works. So I'm talking to a number of the other behavioral scientists. You know, we pretty much agreed that we don't watch mainstream media. You know, if I'm going to look at any of the information, I want to look at it in the written word, because as we've seen with the selective attention test, you know, with the gorilla, whatever, if whatever you're focusing on, other stuff can make it into your mind. It really is a lot of value in understanding the biases to protect ourselves once we know about something. For instance, the decoy effect. Okay, before I knew about that, I'm pretty sure I would have been, you know, falling for it everywhere. And it's not just popcorn, it's anywhere there's three choices, they've usually done it. But now, because I know that's what they're doing, I actually just ask myself, actually, which one do I want? And I just ignore the medium. And of course, I think this is one of the most key points. And it really, when you think about the office of behavior, is it more important to be right or to find the truth? So to be right is obviously the self-image, the ego, but to find truth is really that aspect that's more than that. And I think most of us here, and certainly anyone that's challenging the narrative, I think for the most part, they're more committed to truth than they are to being right. However, in both sides of the narrative, you are going to see certain aspects of the ego. So obviously all the Zooms are free. If you do want to help and support, you can donate there. And for videos, go to reachingpeople.net or info@reachingpeople.net. And let's open it up for Q&A.